He was just the janitor everyone overlooked, until one impossible sentence left the Millionaire CEO speechless. The offices of Harris Global gleamed like a monument to ambition. Everything in the building was polished to perfection. Glass walls that reflected the city skyline, marble floors so pristine they looked untouched, and a subtle but constant aroma of expensive coffee drifting from the executive lounge. The hum of muted conversations and the clicking of designer heels echoed down the hallway as employees rushed between meetings, their eyes glued to their phones or tablets. Elizabeth Harris moved through this world like she owned the air itself. And in a way she did. At 35, she had built her reputation as a millionaire CEO whose sharp decisions and unshakable discipline had taken the company to heights others only dreamed about. She wore a perfectly tailored navy suit, the jacket cut to emphasize her poised frame, her light blonde hair pulled back into a sleek style that framed her striking brown eyes. Every glance she cast seemed to command both respect and a hint of unease. It was on one of these perfectly ordinary mornings that she noticed him for the first time. At the far end of the corridor, near the tall glass partitions, a man in a gray janitor's uniform was polishing the glass with measured, deliberate strokes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and his dark hair fell slightly into his eyes as he worked. There was nothing hurried or careless about his movements. Instead, there was a quiet precision to the way he worked, as if this small task deserved the same attention as any high-stakes business deal. A few members of her staff slowed as they passed him, their voices dipping into low, amused tones. One of the louder employees, known for making jokes at others' expense, stopped just long enough to smirk and toss out a comment loud enough for half the corridor to hear. "Translate this, and the millionaire CEO's salary is yours," he said in a mock-challenging voice, his eyes darting between the janitor and Elizabeth, clearly expecting a laugh from the onlookers. The air changed subtly, a faint ripple of anticipation moving through the group. The janitor straightened, turning his gaze slowly toward the man who had spoken. He didn't flinch, didn't fumble for a reply. Instead, he spoke, not in English, but in flawless, measured French. The words rolled off his tongue with the kind of clarity and confidence that silenced the corridor instantly. There was no hesitation, no self-consciousness, just the kind of natural command that made his voice sound at home, in boardrooms, in diplomatic circles. Elizabeth's eyes narrowed slightly, her attention fully caught now. She understood French, and every word had been not just correct, but elegantly phrased. The smirking employee's grin faltered, the small audience shifting awkwardly before dispersing back to their tasks. The janitor gave no sign of satisfaction at having bested the man. He simply went back to his work, as if nothing unusual had happened. But Elizabeth didn't move on. Something about the way he had handled the moment stayed with her. It wasn't just the language skill. It was the composure, the quiet self-possession of a man who clearly didn't need to prove himself to anyone, yet had done so effortlessly. She walked past him without a word, but her mind was already cataloging questions she didn't yet know how to ask. Who was this man? And what was he doing here, in a job that seemed far beneath his abilities? It was a small encounter, but Elizabeth Harris didn't believe in coincidences. And something told her this wouldn't be the last time she noticed the janitor, with the calm, steady eyes and the voice that had silenced an entire hallway. Elizabeth had always prided herself on her ability to read people quickly. Years of negotiating contracts worth millions and sitting across from seasoned executives had sharpened her instincts to a fine edge. Yet the janitor, Daniel, as she later learned from the name embroidered neatly on his uniform, was an enigma she couldn't easily categorize. The morning after the incident in the hallway, she found herself replaying it in her mind while sipping her coffee in her glass-walled office. The memory of his voice in French lingered, deep, steady, completely unruffled. He had spoken like someone accustomed to commanding attention, not earning it by chance. It didn't fit the narrative of a man whose job involved emptying trash bins and wiping down windows. Later that day, as she walked through the open-plan work area, she saw him again. He was pushing a cleaning cart, his movements efficient but never rushed. What caught her off guard wasn't the work he was doing, but the way he seemed almost invisible to the people around him. Employees passed without a glance, immersed in their own self-importance, while he moved silently between desks, restoring order to the chaos left behind. Elizabeth lingered near the end of the aisle, watching as Daniel paused to pick up a dropped pen and set it gently back on someone's desk. There was no audience for this small gesture, no reason for him to care, and yet he did it. That kind of quiet consideration wasn't common in the high-rise world she inhabited. She forced herself to move on, but not before glancing back once more. That was when she noticed him pull out his phone and check the screen. His face softened instantly, the tension in his jaw easing as he smiled faintly. She caught just enough of his expression to understand. Whoever was on the other end of that phone mattered to him deeply. The following afternoon, she overheard a fragment of his conversation while passing the break room. His voice was warmer than she had imagined it could be, laced with patience and affection. "Hey, buddy, how was your day?" A pause. "Math test? You'll do great, I promise. We can go over it together tonight." The way he spoke, it was obvious he wasn't talking to a colleague. This was his son. Something shifted in her. Elizabeth had been raised in an environment where work consumed every waking moment, where family came second, if it came at all. Her own relationships had suffered under the weight of her ambition, and here was this man doing a physically exhausting, low-status job, yet still finding the energy to be gentle and present for his child. She returned to her office unsettled. She told herself it was simple curiosity, a puzzle she wanted to solve, but there was another layer she couldn't admit, a flicker of admiration she didn't want to name. Later that week, she asked her assistant to quietly pull his personnel file. The document was bare bones. Daniel Carter, 36, single parent to one child. Previous work history included a few service jobs and something vague listed as freelance translation several years back. No university degree, no executive titles, nothing that should have hinted at the poise she had witnessed. Yet as she stared at his file, Elizabeth felt the corners of her mouth twitch. A man like that didn't just appear out of nowhere. People with that kind of composure had histories, and histories always came with stories. And for reasons she couldn't quite explain, she wanted to hear his. It was late on a Thursday evening when Elizabeth found herself once again in the quiet hush of the nearly empty office. Most of her staff had left hours ago, the usual energy of Harris Global replaced by the low hum of the air conditioning and the occasional rattle of the elevator doors. She had been working through a complicated acquisition deal, her desk littered with files and her mind tangled in numbers, when she realized she needed to step away. Her heels clicked softly against the polished marble as she wandered toward the conference rooms, partly to stretch her legs and partly to let her thoughts settle. That was when she heard it. A low, calm male voice, steady but warm, accompanied by faint bursts of laughter. It drew her in like a thread pulling taut. She slowed as she approached one of the smaller, glass-walled meeting rooms and stopped just short of the doorway. Inside, Daniel sat cross-legged on the carpeted floor, his cleaning cart parked neatly against the wall. In front of him, propped on a chair, was a tablet showing the smiling face of a young boy. "Okay, Lucas," Daniel was saying, his tone patient. "Let's go through it one more time. If you have 3 apples and you give one to Sophie, how many do you have left?" The boy on the screen grinned. "2. That's my guy," Daniel said, giving an exaggerated thumbs up that made the child laugh even harder. "See? You're smarter than you think. And tomorrow, when you have that test, I want you to remember. Just slow down, read the question, and breathe." Elizabeth felt a strange tightness in her chest as she watched. She had seen countless fathers, usually distracted, impatient, half listening as their children tried to talk over the noise of their lives. But Daniel wasn't distracted. He wasn't half there. He was completely present, his attention focused entirely on his son, as if nothing else in the world mattered. The conversation continued, moving from math problems to a story about a soccer game at school, then to a reminder about brushing teeth before bed. Lucas spoke quickly, tripping over his words in his excitement, and Daniel listened to every detail, asking questions, encouraging him. The bond between them was palpable. It filled the small conference room like sunlight. Elizabeth realized she had been standing there for several minutes, a silent observer in a moment that wasn't hers. She felt an odd conflict. Part of her wanted to step away and give them privacy, but another part was rooted to the spot, unwilling to break the fragile intimacy she was witnessing. When the call ended, Daniel sat for a moment longer, staring at the blank screen before slipping the tablet back into his bag. His shoulders relaxed, and a faint smile remained on his face as he got to his feet. There was no one there to see it, no one but Elizabeth. Yet the smile stayed, private, and unperformed. She stepped quickly out of sight before he could notice her, retreating toward her office with a quicker pace than before. But her thoughts were no longer on the acquisition deal or the pending negotiations. She kept seeing that small scene in her mind. Daniel in a janitor's uniform, sitting on the floor of a glass-walled room, patiently guiding his son through homework with the care and dedication of a man who had built his entire world around one person. It wasn't just admirable, it was disarming. And Elizabeth Harris didn't like feeling disarmed. The following Monday began like any other. A stream of back-to-back meetings, a dozen unread emails marked urgent, and a board report that needed to be rewritten before noon. Elizabeth moved through it all with her usual precision, but her mind kept straying. Every so often, she would catch herself glancing toward the hallway where she'd first seen Daniel, or remembering the sound of his voice speaking softly to his son in that empty conference room. By early afternoon, she found herself in the break area, pouring coffee into a porcelain mug. She had intended only to take a short pause before diving back into work, but as she turned, she saw him again. Daniel was at the far counter, replacing the water jug in the cooler. It was such an ordinary task, yet there was something deliberate and steady about the way he did it. No fuss, no wasted motion, just quiet efficiency. She told herself it was nothing, but her feet betrayed her, carrying her closer until she was standing a few paces away. "Daniel, right?" she asked, her voice calm but purposeful. He straightened and nodded politely. "Yes, ma'am." "Elizabeth is fine," she corrected. There was a pause. The faintest flicker of surprise crossed his face before his expression settled again. She asked about the incident in the hallway, the translation that had silenced her employees. His eyes lowered for a moment, and then he looked back at her with quiet candor. "I used to work as a translator," he said simply, "mostly freelance. It kept me busy for a few years, but life changed." The last two words carried a weight she could feel but not yet name. She asked gently, "And now?" "Now I work here," he said, his tone neutral. "It's steady, predictable, and it lets me be there for my son." She studied him for a moment. Most people she knew would never accept a job so far below their skill level without resentment leaking through their words. But Daniel didn't sound bitter, only pragmatic. That somehow made his situation even more striking. Elizabeth found herself pressing further. "You must have considered something else, something that matches your abilities better." He gave a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Sometimes people don't need the better option. They need the option that works. Lucas is 10. He needs me home for dinner, at his games, at his parent-teacher meetings. I can't take a job that keeps me away from him just to impress a resume." The words were simple, but they hit her harder than she expected. In her world, success was measured in titles, profit margins, and the size of one's office. Yet here was a man who had deliberately chosen something smaller, something quieter, because it gave him the most important thing of all, time with his child. For a moment, she was at a loss for words. Then, sensing the conversation had run its course, Daniel offered a polite nod and returned to his work. Elizabeth stood there for a moment longer, watching him disappear down the hall with his cart, the faint hum of his wheels fading into the background noise of the office. Back in her glass-walled office, she found herself staring out over the city skyline without really seeing it. She thought about the sacrifices she had made to build Harris Global, the relationships that had fallen away, the family moments she had missed, the nights she had chosen work over companionship. She didn't envy Daniel's job, but she did envy his certainty. And for the first time in years, Elizabeth Harris wondered if she had been chasing the wrong kind of wealth. It was one of those autumn evenings when the city seemed to slow down under the weight of rain. The downpour had started just before sunset, turning the streets into shimmering rivers of light reflected from passing cars. Elizabeth had stayed late at the office, poring over contract revisions, her concentration interrupted only by the occasional rumble of thunder in the distance. By the time she finally closed her laptop, the building was nearly empty, the echoes of her footsteps the only sound in the corridor. She rode the elevator down to the lobby, ready to step into the wet night, when she noticed something unusual. In the far corner of the marble-floored space, near the large glass windows that overlooked the street, Daniel stood with a young boy in his arms. The child's head rested on his shoulder, eyes closed, completely asleep. His small hand curled loosely into the fabric of Daniel's shirt. Daniel wasn't rushing. He wasn't fumbling with bags or looking impatient to get home. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly, holding the boy more securely, his chin resting lightly against the child's hair, as if he were memorizing the moment. The cleaning cart was parked off to the side, and Elizabeth guessed he had been working earlier, but had stopped to pick up his son. Curiosity tugged at her, and she approached. "Long day?" she asked softly, not wanting to wake the boy. Daniel turned toward her, his expression calm but tinged with fatigue. "Yeah, Lucas had to come here after school. My neighbor who usually watches him was sick, and I didn't want him to be alone." Elizabeth glanced at the boy again, noticing how peaceful he looked despite the sterile, echoing lobby around them. "You've been here for hours with him?" Daniel shrugged lightly. "He did some homework. I cleaned when I could. He fell asleep about half an hour ago." Something about the simplicity of his words unsettled her. In her world, a child's unexpected presence during work hours would have been a disruption, a problem to be solved quickly so business could continue uninterrupted. But Daniel spoke as though there had never been a question. Of course, his son would be with him, even if it meant working differently. Outside, the rain showed no sign of letting up. Without thinking too much about it, Elizabeth offered, "I could give you both a ride home. It's pouring out there, and I'm guessing you walk or take the bus." Daniel shook his head, polite but firm. "Thank you, but we'll be fine. We've done this before." It wasn't pride she heard in his voice, not the defensive kind anyway. It was more like a quiet acceptance, the way someone speaks when they built their life around certain limitations and learned to live within them. Elizabeth didn't push. She simply nodded, though she found herself lingering as he shifted Lucas again, careful not to wake him, and moved toward the doors. She watched as the two of them stepped out into the rain, Daniel adjusting his jacket to shield his son from the wind. The sight stayed with her, the broad back of a man carrying his entire world in his arms, disappearing into the blur of water and streetlight. When she finally got into her own car, warm and dry with the hum of the engine around her, she couldn't shake the image. She thought about how many times she had left someone waiting for her. Dinners gone cold, promises postponed, all for the sake of work. She told herself it was worth it, that the empire she had built justified the sacrifices. But that night, as the rain drummed against her windows, she wondered for the first time in years if maybe it hadn't been worth quite as much as she thought. The first snow of the season had arrived overnight, covering the city in a pristine white that sparkled in the pale morning light. From her office high above the streets, Elizabeth could see the slow crawl of traffic, the bundled pedestrians making their way along icy sidewalks, and the faint trail of breath rising from their mouths in the frigid air. Inside Harris Global, the hum of productivity carried on as usual, but there was a subtle shift in the mood. Snow always seemed to soften the edges of even the busiest days. Elizabeth was between meetings when she noticed movement outside her office door. Through the glass, she saw Daniel pushing his cleaning cart, his dark hair dusted lightly with melting snowflakes. He must have just arrived because his gloves were still tucked into the back pocket of his uniform. He paused for a moment in the hallway, glancing down at his phone before slipping it away and moving on. Something about that brief hesitation pulled at her curiosity. A few minutes later, as she made her way toward the elevator, she found him in the service corridor, crouched beside a radiator with a small toolbox. "Cold morning," she said, her voice casual. Daniel looked up, a hint of a smile touching his lips. "Yeah, Lucas loves it, though. First snow always gets him excited." She leaned against the wall, pretending to be in no rush. "He walked to school in this weather?" "He insisted," Daniel replied, "wanted to make the first footprints on the sidewalk." There was a warmth in his tone when he spoke about his son, an easy affection that seemed to change his whole face. For a moment, Elizabeth hesitated. Then she asked, "Do you ever miss doing something else? Something that uses your other skills?" Daniel's expression didn't shift into regret like she half expected. Instead, he straightened, resting one hand on the radiator. "Sometimes, but Lucas is still little. He's only got one childhood. I figure I'll have plenty of time for ambition when he's older. Right now, I just want him to know I'm there." Elizabeth studied him, wondering what it would be like to make a choice like that, to put another person's needs so far above your own, without bitterness or resentment. In her world, everything was transactional. Even acts of kindness came with calculated benefits. But Daniel spoke with the ease of someone who expected nothing in return. Their conversation might have ended there, but a voice called out from down the hall. a security guard informing Daniel that someone had left a package at the front desk for him. Daniel excused himself, and Elizabeth, driven by a curiosity she could no longer quite hide from herself, followed at a distance. At the reception desk, Daniel signed for a small, poorly wrapped box. The guard teased him about early Christmas shopping, but Daniel just smiled, tucking the package under his arm. Once outside in the hallway again, he opened it carefully, revealing a handmade scarf, bright blue, slightly uneven in its stitching. A small note slipped out. Made it in art class, so you don't get cold. Lucas. Elizabeth's breath caught. She wasn't sure why. It was such a small thing, but the pride in Daniel's eyes as he ran his fingers over the yarn made it feel monumental. He folded the scarf with care, placing it gently back into the box before slipping it into his cart. She returned to her office with an odd heaviness in her chest. She had worn jewelry worth more than most people's cars, been gifted luxury watches, designer bags, and rare wines, but none of it had carried the kind of weight that scarf had clearly held for him. It occurred to her, not for the first time, that Daniel Carter's life might look small from the outside, but from the inside, it was rich in ways hers had never been. And the realization was starting to unsettle her more than she wanted to admit. It happened on a Wednesday evening, one of those strange in-between days when winter still gripped the city, but the light lingered a little longer, hinting at spring. Elizabeth had been buried in financial projections all day, the kind of mind-numbing work that left her restless. By the time the building began to empty, she decided to take a walk through the quieter floors to clear her head before heading home. The 12th floor was almost deserted when she stepped out of the elevator. The open space felt cavernous in the absence of chatter, lit only by a few rows of overhead lights. That was when she heard it. Not the usual hum of a vacuum or the faint clang of a mop bucket, but a voice. Soft, low, deliberate. She followed it down a side hallway and stopped when she reached the source. Daniel was there, kneeling on the carpet, his cleaning cart pushed aside. Beside him stood Lucas, dressed in a too-big sweater and holding a stack of index cards. The boy's voice was hesitant, the words broken and halting, but Daniel's face was alight with patience. "Take your time," Daniel said quietly. "You know this one." Lucas stared at the card, his lips forming the first sound, then stopping. His brow furrowed, and he shifted uncomfortably, glancing away. "It's okay," Daniel murmured. "Remember what we practiced. Look at me, breathe, and try again." Elizabeth froze where she stood. She had heard from someone in passing that Lucas struggled with speaking. Selective mutism, they had called it, but she hadn't realized the effort involved in coaxing out each word. The boy inhaled deeply and finally whispered, "River." Daniel's smile widened, genuine pride in his eyes. "Exactly. River. And what's the capital of the state with the Mississippi River?" A pause. Lucas's lips trembled before the word came out, quiet but clear. "Jackson? That's my guy," Daniel said softly. And for a moment, Elizabeth saw something rare, the complete absence of frustration. He wasn't pushing his son to be faster or louder. He was meeting him exactly where he was, building trust one small victory at a time. Lucas shuffled through the cards again, pulling out another. "Me, mountain?" he whispered, almost inaudible. "That's right," Daniel encouraged, tapping the card gently. "And what's the highest mountain in the U.S.? Lucas glanced up and a small smile appeared. "Denali." Elizabeth felt a knot form in her throat. She had sat in meetings where grown men, confident and loud, crumbled under the pressure of her questions. Yet here was a boy facing a mountain far larger than any business challenge she had known, and inching his way over it with the help of a father who refused to let go of his hand. She leaned against the wall unnoticed, listening to them for several more minutes. They worked slowly, steadily, the hallway filled with the rhythm of whispered words and quiet affirmations. When they finally packed up, Daniel ruffled his son's hair and said, "You did amazing today. Tomorrow we'll do even better." Lucas beamed. Not the wide grin of a child showing off, but the deep private smile of someone who knew he had been seen and understood. Elizabeth slipped away before they noticed her, returning to her office with the sound of that whispered river echoing in her ears. For the rest of the night, she couldn't stop thinking about how different the world might be if everyone had someone like Daniel in their corner. someone who believed that progress, no matter how slow, was still worth celebrating. It was the night of the company's annual winter charity gala, the kind of event Elizabeth had attended 100 times before, but never quite enjoyed. The ballroom of the Grand Astoria was glittering with crystal chandeliers and soft gold light, filled with people in elegant evening wear, champagne glasses in hand, discussing mergers and investments as if nothing else in the world existed. Elizabeth had just finished her opening speech when she stepped away from the podium, scanning the crowd. Somewhere near the back, she caught a glimpse of someone completely out of place among the tuxedos and sequin dresses. Daniel, dressed in a simple but well-fitted dark suit, his hair neatly combed, standing near the entrance. Beside him was Lucas, in a crisp white shirt and navy sweater vest, holding tightly to his father's hand. She made her way toward them, curiosity rising. "You came," she said, her tone warmer than she expected it to be. Daniel gave a small nod. "Lucas wanted to see the Christmas tree you mentioned, and we thought maybe we'd drop off the donation." He handed her an envelope, modest compared to the massive checks others would parade tonight, but neatly written in Lucas's careful handwriting, for the children's library. Elizabeth glanced at Lucas, who was looking around the ballroom with wide eyes, clearly overwhelmed, but curious. She knelt slightly to meet his gaze. "That's a wonderful gift, Lucas. The children who get those books will be so lucky." For a moment, the boy hesitated, then took a deep breath. "You're welcome." The words were quiet, almost fragile, but they were his, spoken without prompting. Elizabeth felt something shift in her chest, a small, piercing warmth she hadn't expected. She looked up at Daniel, and the pride in his expression told her everything. This was not just a polite social moment. It was a milestone, one they had worked toward for months. The evening unfolded differently after that. Instead of returning to the safe circle of investors and board members, Elizabeth found herself introducing Daniel and Lucas to people she trusted. Not for networking, but simply because she wanted others to see them the way she did now. At one point, she overheard Daniel speaking with one of the guests, who had casually asked why he worked as a janitor, despite his fluency in multiple languages. His answer was calm, unembellished. "Because it's the best job for raising my son. I can't think of anything more important right now." The guest looked mildly stunned, and Elizabeth couldn't help the faint smile that tugged at her lips. Later, as the evening wound down, she walked them to the door. Snow had started falling again, dusting the street outside in a thin white layer. Lucas clutched a small gift bag, a book one of the guests had given him, and looked up at the towering Christmas tree in the lobby. Daniel thanked her for the evening, but before they stepped out into the cold, Elizabeth said quietly, "You've given me more to think about this year than anyone else." He didn't ask what she meant, just offered a small smile and said, "Sometimes it's not about thinking. It's about choosing what matters." She watched them go, father and son walking side by side into the soft glow of the streetlights, their footprints trailing behind them in the fresh snow. And for the first time in a very long time, Elizabeth Harris felt that the glittering room behind her, the deals, the money, the carefully polished world, seemed strangely small compared to what she had just seen walk out the door. I think the beauty of this story lies in how it flips the usual CEO rescues someone narrative on its head. Instead of the millionaire being the savior, Elizabeth becomes the one quietly transformed. Not by grand gestures, but by witnessing Daniel's quiet integrity, selflessness, and steadfast devotion to his son. The ending works because it doesn't scream for drama. It lingers like a truth you didn't expect to hear. That real wealth isn't measured in money, status, or deals closed, but in the moments you show up for the people who matter. Elizabeth's final image of Daniel and Lucas walking into the snow is powerful because it's not about her stepping in to change their lives. It's about them changing hers without even trying. And that's what makes it unforgettable.